Let's begin by understanding what a partial interest actually means. Essentially, it refers to owning a fraction or a portion of an asset, business, or property. When you have a partial interest, you hold certain rights related to that asset, but you don't have full control over it. This concept is important because it helps us grasp how ownership and valuation work when multiple parties are involved. So, instead of owning something outright, you're sharing ownership with others, which can impact decisions, income, and value. When we talk about ownership and valuation, a key concept to understand is partial interest. This means owning less than 100% of an asset. Unlike full ownership, having a partial interest gives you a defined economic stake and sometimes voting or control rights. But these rights are limited based on how much of the asset you actually own and how that ownership is set up. Now, let's break down the core attributes. First, think of ownership as a slice of a pie. It's fractional, not absolute. You only participate in the value, income, and risks that match your share. So, if you own 30%, you are entitled to 30% of the benefits and bear 30% of the risks. Also, your rights as a partial owner can be limited. You might not have full decision-making power, the freedom to transfer your interests whenever you want, or complete control over the asset on your own. Finally, remember that the real value of your partial interest depends heavily on the specific agreements in place, any restrictions, and how ownership is legally structured. These terms can significantly affect what you can do with your share and how much it's worth. Here we have three common types of partial ownership interests which you'll often encounter. First, real estate interest. This means owning a fraction of land or property, often as tenants in common or joint owners. The rights here can be shared or limited by agreement, so it's important to understand those details. Next, business ownership, where you hold less than a full stake in a company. This interest often comes with certain restrictions, like limits on voting or profit shares, especially common in partnerships, LLCs, or private stock arrangements. Finally, there's trust or estate interest. This gives a beneficiary rights to part of an asset pool, but the actual value depends heavily on factors like timing and access, and control over the assets is usually separate from the economic benefits. Each of these forms represents a different way partial interest can be structured, but they all share the core concept of divided ownership. Now let's look at real-world applications where partial ownership interests are common. These situations arise whenever ownership is divided, inherited, invested in, or transferred in pieces. For example, in real estate, you often see co-owned homes, inherited land, or tenant-in-common arrangements where multiple parties hold shares of the property. In private businesses, partial ownership is typical among founders, family shareholders, or minority equity investors. Partnerships and joint ventures are other key examples, where profits and control are shared among participants. Estate planning also frequently involves transferring fractional interests, often for tax or succession reasons. The typical use case here is having one asset with multiple owners, each holding divided rights and shared stakes. This helps illustrate why understanding ownership and valuation in these contexts is so important. When it comes to ownership and valuation in real estate, one key concept to understand is partial interests. This means a person doesn't have to own 100% of property. Instead, they can share ownership with others. Each owner holds a specific percentage interest in the same property, whether it's a home, land, or building. This type of ownership is often called fractional ownership. With fractional ownership, everyone shares the rights, income, costs, and decisions related to property. That means co-owners typically have to agree on important matters like financing, leasing, major repairs, or selling the property. There are several common ways to structure this kind of ownership. Some typical forms include joint tenancy, where owners have equal shares and rights, tenancy in common, which allows different ownership percentages, and partnership or trust-based ownership, which can add additional layers of management or legal structure. Understanding these options is crucial for anyone looking to invest in real estate with others. Let's talk about ownership and valuation in a business context. When we say partial interests, we mean owning a portion of the company but not necessarily having control over it. For example, if you hold an equity stake of 10 to 40%, you have a share in the company's value and its future profits. However, your management authority, profit rights, and voting power might be limited based on the company's operating agreement. Ownership percentages are important because they define how much of the business's economic benefits you participate in. But it's also key to understand voting rights. They can vary widely. A minority holder with, say, a 10% stake may not have the power to influence major decisions. Interestingly, two investors might each own the same percentage on paper, but their actual control and rights can be very different. This depends on factors like control provisions, transfer restrictions, and governance rules outlined in their agreements. So, ownership isn't just about how much you own, but also about the rights and responsibilities that come with that ownership. When we talk about ownership and valuation, it's important to understand the legal and tax implications that come with holding partial interests. Partial ownership isn't just about having a stake. It's about the rights and limits that stake carries, as well as the tax consequences that follow. First, ownership structure is crucial because it influences control, the ability to transfer your interest, reporting requirements, and the taxable value of your share. Legally, governance is defined by the governing agreement, which sets ownership rights related to voting, income, and usage. Transfer restrictions often come into play, meaning you might need consent or have to give notice before selling your interest, and rights of first refusal can affect who can buy your share. For minority owners, protections can be built into documents to prevent dilution of their stake, forced sales, or unfair control by majority owners. Disputes, such as deadlocks or fiduciary claims, are common between co-owners, so it's important to be aware of these potential issues ahead of time. On the tax front, owners may owe taxes on income allocated to them even if they don't receive actual cash distributions. Estate and gift tax considerations are also significant, since partial interests often change hands during succession planning. Valuation discounts might apply because a lack of control or marketability can reduce the taxable value of your interest. Lastly, keep in mind that tax rules vary depending on the type of entity involved, whether it's a partnership, LLC, corporation, or real estate holding, so each situation needs a tailored approach. Understanding these key points helps ensure you manage ownership and valuation with full awareness of the implications. When valuing partial ownership interests, it's important to understand that these are generally worth less than their proportional share of the underlying asset. The starting point in valuation is the value of the asset itself, but this often gets adjusted downward because partial owners usually have less control over decisions and face greater challenges when trying to sell their share quickly. Control is a key factor. Minority owners often lack the ability to influence important decisions, which reduces the desirability and value of their stake. Marketability is another major consideration. Smaller ownership stakes are usually harder to sell on short notice, leading to reduced liquidity. The takeaway here is simple. Less control and lower liquidity combine to lower the value of a partial interest compared to full ownership. Full ownership provides maximum value because it includes full control rights and easier saleability. That's why the benchmark for valuation is always the full 100% ownership, which carries the highest value basis. In contrast, partial interests are typically discounted to reflect their minority status and illiquidity, with common discount ranges between 10 to 40% depending on specific circumstances. This helps ensure that valuations accurately reflect the real market value of these fractional stakes. When it comes to ownership and valuation, one of the most common sources of conflict arises when co-owners have differing goals, such as when one wants to sell their interest while another prefers to hold on. Disagreements can also emerge over management decisions, how profits are shared, or how the business is valued. Partial ownership interests can work well initially, but problems tend to surface once rights, timing, and control are put to the test. Interestingly, most disputes aren't really about ownership itself, but rather stem from unclear or ambiguous terms. To minimize these conflicts, there are three key resolution priorities we should focus on. First, it's critical to define exit rules early on. This means setting buy-sell agreements, transfer restrictions, and clear valuation methods up front, before any disagreements arise. Second, we need to clarify control rights by documenting exactly who has the authority to make decisions related to operations, distributions, financing, and major asset actions. Finally, if disputes do occur, the process for resolving them should escalate in structured stages. Start with negotiation, then move to mediation or arbitration if needed, and reserve litigation as the last resort. This approach helps keep conflicts contained and managed more effectively. Let's review the key takeaways about partial interest in ownership. First, a partial interest means you have less than full ownership, which is important to keep in mind. The rights here depend heavily on how the agreement is structured, so those details really matter. When ownership is shared, it usually means sharing control and risks, which can complicate decisions. Because of this, the value of a partial interest can often be reduced due to lack of control or challenges in selling it. Finally, it's crucial to understand the legal terms and tax implications before any transfer or valuation takes place. These essentials help us grasp the complexities involved when ownership is shared, limited, or divided.